till secrets do us part. The cathedral was drenched in golden candlelight, the air thick with the scent of white roses. Eleanor and Daniel stood before the officiant, hands clasped, eyes locked. Their love had withstood long-distance career struggles, and even meddling in-laws. Nothing could shake them now, until the doors burst open. A man in a dark suit strode in, his polished shoes clicking ominously against the marble. He wasn't on the guest list. The crowd murmured in confusion. Daniel. "Lancaster," the man called out, his voice calm yet commanding. "Before you say, 'I do,' I need to tell you who you really are." Silence fell. Eleanor tightened her grip on Daniel's hands. She felt the tension coil in his muscles. "Excuse me?" Daniel's voice was measured, but she could feel the slight tremor beneath. The man's sharp blue eyes met his. "You're not a Lancaster, you're a Rossetti!" Gasps erupted from the pews. Eleanor felt her stomach drop. The Rossetti name was infamous. A family tangled in political scandals, financial corruption, and a suspicious disappearance decades ago. Daniel's mother, Margaret Lancaster, shot up from her seat, her face drained of color. "This is absurd!" she hissed. "I demand you leave now!" But the man held up a file. "DNA evidence, birth records, all forged until now. Your mother, if she really is your mother, has kept this from you for 32 years. Eleanor turned to Daniel, but his face had gone pale, his expression unreadable. "Mom," he rasped, "is this true?" Margaret's lips quivered. Then, instead of answering, she turned, grabbing her purse, her movements sharp. It was all the answer they needed. The investigation begins. The wedding was abandoned. The guests trickled out, whispering about the scandal. Eleanor and Daniel sat in the empty ballroom, untouched champagne flutes between them. "So, let me get this straight." Eleanor exhaled, trying to organize the chaos. "You might be the missing Rossetti heir, the same family that disappeared after a massive financial scandal in the 90s? Daniel stared at the velvet tablecloth, jaw clenched. "I don't know what to believe anymore." Eleanor reached for his hand. "Then we find out." They spent the next few weeks unraveling the mystery. Margaret refused to speak to them, retreating to her estate in the countryside. The man from the wedding, Jonathan Pierce, turned out to be a private investigator hired by an anonymous client. Who wanted Daniel to know the truth? And why now? They tracked down an old Rossetti family lawyer who revealed chilling details. The Rossetti empire didn't just collapse, it was sabotaged. The youngest son, Alexander, was presumed dead, but his body was never found. If Daniel is Alexander, that means someone stole his entire identity. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Someone wanted him hidden. Daniel's grip on the table tightened. And my mother helped them do it. Unraveling the past, the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. Eleanor noticed a black sedan following them. Their home was broken into, drawers ransacked. Margaret finally broke her silence with a chilling message. "Stop searching, it's not safe." But they were too deep now. Then, Eleanor found the missing puzzle piece, an old newspaper article buried in an archive. Alexander Rossetti survived the fire, but a child's body was discovered in his place. Daniel inhaled sharply. Who was that? Child? Then the realization hit. "Daniel," Eleanor whispered, "what if you were never supposed to live?" The final revelation confronting Margaret was inevitable. They arrived at her estate under cover of darkness, breaking past the security gates. "Tell me the truth," Daniel demanded. "Who am I?" Margaret sat by the fireplace, a tumbler of whiskey in her frail hands. Her eyes glistened. "You were my greatest sin." She confessed it all. The Rossetti empire wasn't sabotaged. It was silenced. The family had made enemies in high places, and the youngest son was marked for death. Margaret, once a trusted Rossetti employee, had been given a choice. Hand over. the child or disappear forever. So she ran. She raised Daniel as her own, forging his past, hoping to keep him safe. But someone's found you, she murmured. And they won't stop now. A sudden knock at the door froze them all. Eleanor's heart pounded. Daniel exhaled. Who is it? Margaret's lips trembled. The people I stole you from. Would their love survive the truth? Could they fight the forces that wanted Daniel erased forever? Their wedding day had ended in betrayal, but their journey was just beginning. Chapter 6. Shadows at the Door. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. Eleanor felt her pulse hammering in her throat. Daniel tensed beside her. Margaret took a sharp breath, gripping the armrest of her chair like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Don't open it, she whispered. Too late. The lock clicked. The heavy oak door creaked open, revealing a man in a tailored charcoal suit. He stepped inside like he owned the room, the scent of expensive cologne trailing after him. His silver hair was neatly combed back, his features sharp and aged like someone who'd played the game of power for decades and won. Daniel Rossetti, the man said, his voice eerily smooth. We finally meet. Daniel straightened, masking his fear with cold resolve. Who the hell are you? A slow smirk. Vincent Rossetti, your uncle. Chapter 7. The Price of the Past. Vincent settled into one of Margaret's antique chairs, crossing his legs like this was a casual reunion. His bodyguards remained at the door, unmoving. You've made quite the spectacle, he said, studying Daniel, digging into things that should remain buried. Daniel's hands curled into fists. Maybe if someone had told me the truth, I wouldn't have to dig. Vincent's smirk didn't waver. Truth is subjective, nephew. What matters is what's left standing when the dust settles. His gaze flicked to Eleanor. And who's left standing beside you? Eleanor's stomach turned. There was something about his words, like a veiled threat wrapped in polite conversation. Why are you here? She demanded. Vincent ignored her, turning back to Daniel. Your father, my dear brother, was a visionary, but he was reckless. He made enemies, powerful ones. When the fire happened, I assumed you perished. But your mother, here, he cast a pointed look at Margaret, decided otherwise. Margaret inhaled sharply. I saved him. Vincent shrugged. Perhaps. Or perhaps you stole him from the only family that could have protected him. Daniel's patience snapped. Protected me? My entire life was a lie. And now I find out I'm the heir to a family I know nothing about, one with a history of corruption and scandal? Why should I believe a word you say? Vincent leaned forward, his smirk fading. Because, dear boy, you were never supposed to live, and the people who wanted you dead, they know you're alive now. Silence. Eleanor felt a chill creep up her spine. They won't stop, Vincent continued. They've been waiting. Watching. The moment you started digging, you led them straight to yourself. Margaret's face was pale. You have to leave. Daniel shook his head. I'm done running. Vincent sighed, like a teacher disappointed in a foolish student. Then you have two choices, nephew. You can either embrace who you are and reclaim your rightful place, or you can watch everything you love burn. His eyes flicked to Eleanor again, starting with her. Chapter 8. Running out of time, Vincent left as easily as he arrived, but his words clung to the air like poison. Margaret was the first to speak. You can't trust him. Daniel was still staring at the door. I know. Eleanor stepped closer. But he's right about one thing, Daniel. Whoever wanted you dead, they know about you now, and they won't stop. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his temples. Then we find them first. Margaret shook her head. This isn't a fight you can win. You have no idea how deep this goes. Then tell. Me! Daniel's voice cracked. I'm tired of the secrets, Mom. Margaret hesitated. Finally, she crossed the room and unlocked a small chest hidden beneath the bookshelves. From it, she pulled out a stack of old letters, a single worn-out passport, and a gun. She placed them on the table. "If you really want the truth," she whispered, "it starts here." Eleanor picked up the letters, scanning the first one. The handwriting was rushed, panicked. "If they find out he's alive, they will come for him. They will come for all of us." She looked up, heart pounding. Daniel's past wasn't just dangerous. It was a ticking time bomb. Chapter 9. Love and War As. They pored over the documents. Eleanor felt the weight of something inevitable pressing down on them. This wasn't just a family secret. It was a war brewing in the shadows, and Daniel was at the center of it. "You don't have to stay in this," he told her later that night, his voice quiet. "This isn't what we planned." Eleanor turned to him, searching his face. "No, it's not." Then she reached for his hand. "But I didn't say yes at the altar because I wanted a perfect life. I said yes because I wanted you, no matter what came next." A soft exhale. His fingers tightened around hers. For the first time since their wedding day, he let himself smile. Then, from outside, a car engine rumbled to a stop. A knock echoed through the house. Their time had just run out. Would Daniel uncover the full truth before it was too late? Would their love survive the past, hunting him down? Because some secrets don't just break hearts. They kill, to be continued. Chapter 10. The visitors in the night. The knock was sharp, measured. It wasn't the kind of knock a lost traveler made. It was the kind that sent a message. Daniel and Eleanor exchanged a glance. Margaret paled. "Don't answer it." But Daniel was already moving. He grabbed the gun Margaret had placed on the table, checking the safety before tucking it into the back of his waistband. Eleanor's heart pounded as she followed him to the door. "Daniel." "I won't let them control this," he murmured, voice steady. Then he opened the door. Two men stood on the porch, dressed in black suits, their expressions unreadable. Between them stood a woman, a sharp-featured brunette with piercing, green eyes. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Hello, Alexander," she said smoothly. "Or should I call you Daniel?" Daniel didn't blink. "Who are you?" The woman tilted her head. "I go by many names, but for now you can call me Camille." Margaret inhaled sharply. Eleanor caught the slight tremor in her hands. "You know her," Eleanor realized. Margaret's voice was hoarse. "She worked for your father." Camille's smirk deepened. "I did more than that. I cleaned up after your father. I handled loose ends." Her gaze flicked to Daniel. "Like you." Eleanor felt Daniel tense beside her. "What do you want?" Daniel's voice was cold. Camille stepped forward. "You don't get it, do you? You weren't just hidden for your safety. You were hidden because your existence is dangerous." Margaret stepped between them. "Leave. Now." Camille didn't even look at her. "I'm not here to kill you, Daniel. I'm here to make an offer." Daniel crossed his arms. "I'm listening." Camille's smile widened. "Smart boy." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a sleek black envelope. "There are people who would prefer you stay dead, but others, they're willing to negotiate." Daniel took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single business card, a name, an address. "Tomorrow," Camille said. "Midnight. Come alone, and maybe, just maybe, you'll get answers." Then she turned, disappearing into the night with her men. The moment the door shut, Margaret grabbed Daniel's arm. "You can't go." Daniel met her gaze. "I have to." Eleanor's stomach twisted. "Daniel." But she could see it in his eyes. He had already made up his mind. Chapter 11. Love Against the Fire. They argued for hours. Margaret was furious. You don't know who you're walking into. Camille doesn't offer things. She takes them. Daniel was unshaken. Then I'll take something. Back! Eleanor watched them go back and forth, her pulse thudding. Every part of her was screaming that this was a trap, that if Daniel went, he might not come back, so she made a choice. If you go, I go, she said firmly. Daniel turned to her. Eleanor, no. She stepped closer, forcing him to see the fear in her eyes. We were supposed to be planning our honeymoon. Instead, we're unraveling a past that wants you dead. But I won't let you do this alone. His jaw tightened. I can't risk you. And I can't risk losing you. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. You're impossible. Eleanor arched a brow. So are you. A small, reluctant smile tugged at his lips. Then he nodded. All right, we go together. Margaret sighed, rubbing her temples. Then you'd better be ready for war. Chapter 12. Into the Lion's Den. The meeting place was an abandoned high-rise on the outskirts of the city. The kind of place where things happened and no one asked questions. Daniel and Eleanor stepped inside, the dim lighting casting long shadows. Camille was waiting. Alone. Brave, she mused. Or foolish. Daniel didn't flinch. You wanted me here. Talk. Camille studied him. Then she tossed a folder onto the table. Inside were surveillance photos, bank transfers, old newspaper clippings. Eleanor's breath hitched. Every piece of Daniel's hidden life laid bare. Your father was a powerful man, Camille said. But power breeds enemies. The Rossetti family was set up to fall. You weren't meant to survive. Daniel's voice was tight. Who wanted me dead? Camille leaned in. Everyone. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Camille flipped through the photos. Your Uncle Vincent? He helped erase you? Your father's closest advisors? They signed the orders? And your mother? She flicked her gaze to Daniel. She wasn't the hero you think. She was. Daniel stiffened. What are you saying? Camille sighed. I'm saying that Margaret Lancaster didn't save you because she loved you. She let the words sink in. She saved you because she needed you. Eleanor felt Daniel's entire body go rigid. You're lying. Camille smirked. Am I? She slid a final piece of paper across the table, a single handwritten letter. Eleanor leaned in, reading the faded ink. If the boy lives, I can control the inheritance. No one else can take it. He is the key to everything. Signed, Margaret Lancaster. Daniel's breath came in sharp, uneven pulls. Margaret had orchestrated everything, not to protect him. Chapter 13. The knife in the dark, Daniel didn't speak as they drove back to the estate. His fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly Eleanor thought it might snap. The revelation about Margaret still hung between them like smoke. Thick, choking, impossible to escape. Finally, she broke the silence. You don't believe Camille, do you? Daniel's jaw tightened. I don't know. Eleanor hesitated. Daniel, it could be a manipulation. She wants you to turn against Margaret. Or Margaret's been lying to me my whole life. His voice was edged with something raw. Eleanor exhaled. We need proof. Daniel's grip on the wheel loosened slightly. Then we get it. When they pulled up to the estate, the house was dark, but something felt off. Eleanor tensed. Stay here, Daniel said, already reaching for the gun tucked into his waistband. Not a chance, she muttered, following him. Inside, the air was unnaturally still. A lamp in the study flickered, casting eerie shadows. Then Eleanor saw it, a smear of blood on the marble floor. Daniel cursed under his breath and rushed forward. The trail led toward the parlor. Margaret was slumped in an armchair, her face pale. A deep cut across her shoulder. Mother! Daniel was at her side in an instant, pressing a hand against the wound. Her eyes fluttered open. Daniel! Eleanor grabbed the first aid kit from the cabinet and knelt beside them. What happened? Margaret's voice was weak. They were already inside. Daniel's face darkened. Who? Margaret swallowed hard. Vincent. A cold dread settled in Eleanor's chest. Daniel's uncle. The man who helped erase his existence. Where? Is he? Daniel demanded. Margaret's grip tightened on his sleeve. Gone! But he left a message. Her gaze flickered toward the fireplace. On the mantel, written in smeared blood, was a single word. Run. Chapter 14. The Trap. Titans. Margaret winced as Eleanor tightened the bandage around her shoulder. I should have seen this coming, she muttered. Daniel stood near the window, jaw clenched, staring out into the night. Tell me everything. No more lies. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, as if steeling herself. Camille was right about some things. Your father had enemies. But what she didn't tell you is that Vincent was the one who orchestrated it all. Daniel turned sharply. You're saying my uncle ordered the hit? Margaret nodded. Your father thought he could control Vincent. But Vincent wanted everything. Money, power, the Rossetti name. When I realized what was happening, I faked your death to keep you safe. It was the only way. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. Then why did you write that letter? The one Camille showed us? Margaret flinched. Because I knew if I didn't have leverage, they would come for you again. The inheritance, the money. I used it as a shield to keep them away. But Vincent never stopped looking for you. Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. And now he knows I'm alive. Margaret's voice was grim. He won't stop until you're dead. A heavy silence fell. Eleanor finally spoke. Then we stop him first. Daniel looked at her, and for the first time since they met Camille, a spark of determination returned to his eyes. Agreed. Chapter 15. The bait. The plan was risky. Vincent wanted Daniel to run, which meant the last thing he would expect was for Daniel to walk straight into his territory. Vincent owns a club on the west side of the city, Margaret said as they geared up. That's where he does business. If you show up, he'll see it as a challenge. Daniel checked the magazine of his gun. Good. Eleanor grabbed his wrist. You don't have to do this alone. Daniel softened, brushing a hand against her cheek. I won't lose you. You won't. Her grip tightened. Because we're doing this. Together. Margaret glanced between them. Then let's end this. Chapter 16. The showdown. The club was packed. Music thumped through the floor and cigarette smoke curled in the air. Daniel spotted Vincent immediately. He was seated in a private booth surrounded by bodyguards, a glass of whiskey in one hand. The moment Vincent saw Daniel, he smiled. Well, well, Vincent drawled. Look who finally decided to stop playing dead. Daniel strode forward. You sent your men to my house. Vincent smirked. Consider it a warning. I have bigger plans for you, nephew. Eleanor's blood ran cold at the way he said nephew. Daniel's voice was low. You should have finished the job years ago. Vincent chuckled. You think you're here for revenge? He leaned in. You don't even know the half of it. Then Eleanor saw it. A shadow moving behind Daniel. One of Vincent's men reaching for a knife. Daniel, behind you, she shouted. Everything erupted at once. Gunfire, shouting, chaos. Eleanor ducked as a bodyguard lunged at her, grabbing a bottle and smashing it against his head. Daniel spun, slamming an elbow into his attacker's face before wrenching the knife away and driving it into his side. Margaret pulled a pistol from her coat and fired a warning shot. Chapter 17. A silence that cuts. The club was eerily quiet. Vincent's body lay sprawled across the floor, a dark pool of blood spreading beneath him. The gun was still warm in Daniel's grip. Margaret exhaled shakily, lowering her own weapon. It's over. But it wasn't. Eleanor could feel it. She could feel it in the way Daniel was looking at her, like he didn't know who she was anymore. Ask your wife why she was really at your wedding. The words slithered between them like a snake. Daniel's voice was quiet, but it was sharper than any blade. Tell me he was lying. Eleanor's breath caught. Daniel. His fingers flexed. Around the gun. Tell me. Her pulse thundered in her ears. There was a right answer here. A safe answer. But she didn't have it. Margaret took a step forward. This isn't the place. Daniel barely spared her a glance. Stay out of this. Eleanor forced herself to hold his gaze. I swear to you, I love you. Daniel's expression didn't change. That's not what I asked. Eleanor's throat tightened. Please. Then Daniel did something that scared her more than the gunfire, more than the blood, more than anything Vincent could have done. He stepped back. He stepped away from her. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her. Feet, Daniel, he didn't answer. He just turned and walked out the door. Chapter 18. What Comes Next? Eleanor sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at the wall. She had cleaned Vincent's blood from her hands, changed out of her ruined dress, but no matter how many times she scrubbed, the weight of what happened wouldn't wash away. Margaret was standing near the window, arms crossed. He'll come back. Eleanor wasn't so sure. The look in Daniel's eyes when he left. She had seen that look before. It was the look of a man on the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to jump. Margaret sighed. You have to tell him. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the hem of her dress. If I do, I lose him. Margaret gave her a knowing look. And if you don't? Eleanor didn't answer. She didn't have to, because deep down, she already knew. She was losing him either way. Chapter 19. The Man in the Shadows. Daniel hadn't planned on coming to the docks, but when your entire life falls apart in a matter of hours, rational decision-making tends to take a back seat. The air was thick with salt and diesel as he leaned against the railing, staring at the inky black water. His mind kept replaying Vincent's words. Ask your wife why she was really at your wedding. Daniel had trusted Eleanor with everything, with his heart, his life. And now, doubt was eating him alive. A voice cut through the darkness. Hell of a night, isn't it? Daniel turned sharply, hand instinctively moving to his gun. A man stepped out of the shadows, tall, expensively dressed, and somehow familiar. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Who the hell are you? The man smiled. Someone who knows the truth. Daniel's grip tightened. Truth about what? The man tilted his head. Your wife. Something cold slithered down Daniel's spine. Tell me, he said, his voice low. The man's smile widened. Oh, Daniel, he chuckled. You don't want the truth. Daniel's jaw clenched. Try me. The man took a slow step closer. Eleanor, he said, wasn't just at your wedding. His voice dropped to a whisper. She was sent there. To be continued? Who sent Eleanor to the wedding? What has she been hiding? And will Daniel ever be able to trust her again? Because love can endure many things. But once the truth is out, it can never be buried again. Let me know if you want even more twists, betrayals, or danger. Chapter 20. The truth. That burns Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. She was sent there. The words lingered, heavy and suffocating. His fingers curled into fists. Sent by who? The man in the shadows took his time, enjoying the torment laced in Daniel's voice. Finally, he said, You already know. Daniel's breath stilled. No, it couldn't be. But deep inside, something in him already knew. His father, Victor Langston, the man who built an empire on deception. Daniel's voice was razor sharp. "Why?" The man shrugged. "Insurance. Your father needed to make sure you stayed in line. He had his doubts about you, about your loyalties." Daniel's heart clenched. "Eleanor knew?" The man smirked. Oh, she knew. Something inside Daniel fractured. Chapter 21. A Marriage of Lies. Eleanor heard the door open before she saw him. Daniel stood in the doorway of the hotel suite, the light behind him casting sharp shadows over his face. But his eyes were nothing but fire and ice. She stood. "Daniel," he was across the room in 3 strides. "Tell me the truth." Her mouth went dry. "What?" Daniel grabbed her wrist, not hard, not painful, but enough that she felt the weight of what he wasn't saying. "Did my father send you to the wedding?" Eleanor's breath hitched. It was the moment she had feared, the moment she had fought to keep buried. She swallowed hard. "Daniel, it's not what you think." His jaw tensed. "Then tell me what it is." Silence stretched between them like a chasm. Eleanor opened her mouth, then closed it, because there was no way to say it without breaking him. Finally, Daniel let go of her wrist, and the absence of his touch was worse than any slap. He nodded slowly, almost to himself. "That's all I needed to know." He turned for the door. Panic seized Eleanor's chest. "Wait!" He paused, but didn't look back. Eleanor forced the words out. "At first, yes. Your father asked me to be there, to watch you, to make sure you didn't step out of line." Daniel's whole body went rigid, but it stopped being about him. Her voice cracked. "It stopped the moment I fell in love with you." Daniel exhaled sharply, as if those words physically struck him. But when he finally looked at her, there was nothing left in his eyes but devastation. Chapter 22. Sins of the Father. Margaret was waiting outside, cigarette in hand. The moment Daniel stepped out, she studied his face. "That bad?" Daniel let out a humorless laugh. "Worse." Margaret sighed, exhaling smoke into the night air. "You gonna forgive her?" Daniel leaned against the railing. "I don't know." Margaret eyed him. "Do you want to?" He hesitated. Then, finally, he admitted, "I don't know." Margaret nodded as if she understood. And maybe she did, because some betrayals weren't simple. Some wounds weren't just about the lie, but about what the truth stole from you, and Eleanor had stolen something from Daniel, not just trust, not just love, but the choice to love her freely. Chapter 23. Unfinished Business Victor. Langston sat in his penthouse office, swirling whiskey in his glass. The door opened, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Victor didn't bother looking up. "You were careless." The man, Elliot Crane, Daniel's informant, smirked. "You wanted him to know, didn't you?" Victor chuckled. "Oh, Elliot, you always were my best pawn." Elliot crossed his arms. "And Eleanor?" Victor finally looked up. His gaze was cold, calculating. She served her purpose. Elliot stiffened. "And if she becomes a problem?" Victor smiled. Then, very casually, he said, "Then we remove her from the board." To be continued. Will Daniel ever trust Eleanor again? Will Victor make his move? And how far will Eleanor go to prove her love before it's too late? Because some love stories don't end with happily ever after. Some end with war. Let me know if you want even more twists, danger, and betrayal. Chapter 24. The war begins. Eleanor couldn't sleep. The bed felt cold without Daniel beside her. His absence was more than physical. It was a wound, gaping and raw. She had betrayed him, and now she had to fix it. Margaret's voice cut through. her thoughts. "Still awake?" Eleanor looked up. Margaret was leaning against the door frame, arms crossed, eyes sharp. "I assume you're not planning to sit here and cry all night," Margaret said. Eleanor squared her shoulders. "No." Margaret arched a brow. "Good. Because if Victor Langston wants you gone, you won't have time for tears." Eleanor inhaled slowly. "Then I need to strike first." Margaret smirked. "Now we're talking." Chapter 25. A Father's. Rath Daniel stood outside his father's penthouse, rage burning through his veins. Victor Langston had played him, used him, and Eleanor. He still didn't know how to feel about Eleanor. The betrayal cut deep. But the way she looked at him, like she was breaking, haunted him. But first, he needed to deal with Victor. The guards let him through. He stepped into the lavish penthouse, where his father waited by the bar, unfazed. Victor smiled. "Son, you look terrible." Daniel's fists clenched. "You used Eleanor against me." Victor chuckled. "I did what I had to do." "You destroyed my marriage." Victor took a slow sip of whiskey. "Oh, Daniel, if a single lie could destroy it, then it was never strong to begin with." Daniel's hands trembled with fury. "You don't get to decide that." Victor sighed, setting his glass down. "I always decide." And that's when Daniel knew. His father would never stop. Not until he burned everything Daniel loved to the ground. Chapter 26. The deal Eleanor sat across from Elliot Crane in a dimly lit cafe. She hated being here. Hated needing him, but she had no choice. Elliot studied her, amused. "You must be desperate if you came to me." Eleanor met his gaze. "I need information." Elliot leaned back. "And what makes you think I'll help?" She placed a thick envelope on the table. "Because I know you, Elliot. You only care about money." Elliot smirked. "Fair enough. What do you want to know?" Eleanor's voice was steady. "Victor Langston. His weaknesses, his secrets. The things even Daniel doesn't know." Elliot chuckled. "Now that's dangerous information." Eleanor held his gaze. "Then I guess I'm feeling dangerous." Chapter 27. The target Victor Langston stood in his office watching the city lights. A man entered behind him, tall, ruthless, deadly. Victor didn't turn around. "Do it cleanly," the assassin's voice was cold. "And if she resists," Victor finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "Then make it look like an accident. To be continued." Will Eleanor uncover Victor's secrets before he eliminates her? Will Daniel realize the danger before it's too late? Because some battles aren't won with love. Some are won with blood. Let me know if you want even more danger, suspense, and betrayal. Shadows closing. Eleanor felt the eyes on her long before she saw them. She had learned to recognize the weight of a stare, how it prickled against her skin, how it sent a silent warning through her bloodstream. She didn't turn around. Didn't react. Instead, she adjusted her sunglasses, casually stepping into the nearest boutique. The glass window reflected the street behind her. A man. Tall, dark jacket. He wasn't looking directly at her, but he didn't need to. He was following her. She exhaled slowly. "Stay calm. Stay smart." The shopkeeper greeted her, but she barely heard. Her mind was calculating her next move. Then, through the reflection, she saw him take out his phone. Her stomach turned to ice. He's calling someone. This isn't just surveillance. It's a signal. She had to move. Now. Chapter 29. The setup, Daniel sat in his apartment, staring at the whiskey bottle in front of him. He hadn't touched it yet, but the weight of everything, Eleanor's betrayal, his father's control, the realization that he had been a pawn, pressed down on him. A knock at the door snapped him from his thoughts. Margaret. She stepped inside without waiting for permission. Your wife's about to be killed. Daniel's blood ran cold. What? Margaret shut the door behind her. Victor put a hit on her. It'll look like an accident. Daniel was already grabbing his jacket. Margaret crossed her arms. So, you still love her? He didn't answer. Because love wasn't the question. The real question was, could he get to Eleanor before his father did? Chapter 30. The attack. Eleanor knew she had minutes. She slipped through the boutique's back door, stepping into a narrow alley. Footsteps followed. She ran. The alley twisted and turned, buildings looming overhead. She reached for her phone. A hand grabbed her wrist. She twisted, elbow striking. The man caught her arm. Fast, too fast. Then, a gun pressed to her ribs. Don't fight, the assassin murmured. It'll be easier that way. Adrenaline crashed through her. No, not like this. She drove her knee up, hard. The assassin grunted, stumbling back just enough. She yanked free, bolting down the alley. A second figure stepped into her path, tall, ruthless, smiling. Going somewhere? And this time, there was no escape. Chapter 31. A bullet and a choice. Daniel's car screeched to a stop. He jumped out, gun drawn. The alley was dimly lit, shadows moving. Then, a figure struggling. Eleanor. A man held her against the wall, hand tightening around her throat. Daniel didn't hesitate. He fired. The shot echoed, the assassin crumpling. Eleanor gasped. Stumbling forward, Daniel caught her. For a moment, she just stared at him, breathless. You... He pulled her closer. You okay? Her eyes were wide. Daniel, your father... He already knew. And for the first time, he knew exactly what he had to do. Victor Langston had crossed the line. Now? Now Daniel was going to end him. To be continued. Will Daniel finally break free from his father's control? Can Eleanor survive the war she never meant to start? Because this isn't just about love anymore. This is revenge. Chapter 32. No more running. Eleanor clung to Daniel, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could still feel the assassin's hands around her throat, the sharp press of the gun against her ribs. She had come seconds away from dying. Daniel's grip tightened around her. His body was tense, his breathing ragged. The gun in his hand was still warm from the shot. Finally, he pulled back, his gaze burning into hers. Are you hurt? She shook her head, but the truth was, she wasn't sure. Daniel exhaled sharply, scanning the alley. We need to go, now. Eleanor swallowed. And then what? His jaw clenched. Then we end this. Chapter 33. The Deal with the Devil Victor. Langston swirled his whiskey, watching the city lights from his penthouse. The door opened, and a familiar figure stepped in. Elliot Crane. Victor didn't turn. Tell me something useful. Elliot smirked. You won't like it. Victor finally looked at him. Humor me. Elliot leaned in. Daniel isn't running anymore. Victor's grip on the glass tightened. He's coming for you. Victor set his drink down. Calm. Too calm. Then let him. Elliot studied him. You think you still have control? Victor smiled. I don't think. I know. Because he still had a card left to play, and when he used it, Daniel wouldn't just lose. He'd break. Chapter 34. Confrontation. Daniel and Eleanor stood outside a dimly lit office building. Margaret leaned against the car, arms crossed. You really think this is going to work? Daniel's jaw was tight. It has to. Margaret sighed. Victor doesn't lose, Daniel. You know that. Daniel's eyes darkened. Then I'll make sure this is his first time. Eleanor hesitated. What if... Daniel turned to her, his voice gentler. We stop asking what if, Eleanor. We win. Eleanor swallowed. She wasn't used to seeing Daniel like this, so cold, so determined. But she knew. Victor had pushed him too far. There was no turning back now. Only war. Chapter 35. The trapped Victor's office was quiet, too quiet. Daniel stepped inside, his every sense on high alert. Eleanor followed closely behind. Heart pounding, the desk was empty. The chair sat still. But something was wrong. Then, the door clicked shut behind them. Victor's voice filled the room. Smooth, amused, unshaken. "Welcome, son." Lights flickered on, revealing Victor standing. Across the room, flanked by 2 armed guards. Daniel didn't flinch. "Cut the theatrics," Victor chuckled. "You always were impatient." Eleanor tensed as Victor's gaze flicked to her. "And you... I have to admit, I underestimated you." Daniel took a step forward. "Call it off." Victor raised a brow. "Call what off?" Daniel's fist clenched. "The hit, the setup, the game." Victor sighed, shaking his head. "You still don't get it, do you?" He gestured to the guards, who stepped forward, weapons raised. "You don't dictate the rules, Daniel." His smile was cold. "I do." To be continued. Can Daniel and Eleanor escape Victor's trap, or has Victor already won? Because this isn't just a fight, it's a reckoning. Let me know if you want even more high-stakes twists, betrayal, and psychological warfare. Цей уміст може порушувати наші правила використання. Якщо ми помилилися, повідомте нас про це, поставивши цій відповіді палець униз. Chapter 36. The Price of Freedom. Daniel didn't move. Neither did Eleanor. The guards had their weapons raised, but Victor hadn't given the order yet. That was his style. He wanted Daniel to squirm. Too bad for him. Daniel wasn't scared anymore. Victor stepped closer, adjusting his cufflinks. "You never did learn your place, son." Daniel's voice was steady. "And you never learned that I don't take orders." Victor smiled, slow and indulgent. "You think you're here to negotiate?" He chuckled. "No, Daniel. You're here because I let you be here." Eleanor's fingers brushed against Daniel's just for a second. A silent question. "What's the move?" Daniel's answer was simple. He struck. Chapter 37. Chaos in the Lion's Den. The next 3 seconds exploded into violence. Daniel grabbed the closest guard's wrist, twisting it sharply. The gun fired, wild, uncontrolled, before Daniel drove his knee into the man's stomach. Eleanor ducked as the second guard swung at her, but she was faster. She grabbed a paperweight from the desk and slammed it into his temple. Victor didn't flinch, didn't even move, just watched and smiled. Daniel turned toward him, chest rising and falling. "Still think you're in control?" Victor's expression remained unreadable. Then, slowly, he lifted a hand. A gun was already waiting in it, pointed directly at Eleanor. Daniel's stomach turned to ice. Victor sighed. Sk, sk, so predictable. Eleanor froze, her breath shallow. Victor's finger tightened on the trigger. "Now," he murmured, "let's talk." Chapter 38. A devil's bargain. Daniel felt the weight of the moment like a vice around his throat. If he moved, Victor would shoot. If he hesitated, Victor would win. "Let her go," Daniel said, voice razor-sharp. Victor tilted his head. "And why would I do that?" Daniel's pulse pounded. He needed an opening, a way to turn the tables. Victor smirked as if reading his mind. "You're out of moves, son." Then a phone rang. Victor frowned, glancing at the device buzzing in his pocket. Daniel saw his chance. Chapter 39. Checkmate. The moment Victor looked away, Eleanor lunged. She knocked his arm to the side, throwing off his aim. The gun fired, a deafening blast, before clattering to the floor. Daniel tackled Victor, driving him hard against the desk. Victor grunted, trying to fight back, but Daniel was done playing games. He grabbed his father's collar, slamming him down for the first time. Victor looked, shaken. Daniel leaned in, voice low. "Dangerous. This is over," Victor chuckled, despite the blood at the corner of his mouth. "You really think so?" Daniel didn't answer, because he knew something Victor didn't. Outside, sirens were approaching. Fast. Victor's expression darkened. "You—" Daniel straightened. "You said I don't make the rules." He stepped back as red and blue lights flooded the room. "Well, neither do you." The doors burst open, agents storming in, weapons drawn. Victor was still smiling as they surrounded him. Because he knew this wasn't the end, not even close, to be continued. Victor's empire is crumbling. But has he truly lost? Or is this just another game? And for Daniel and Eleanor, what happens when the past refuses to stay buried? Because some secrets? They never die. Let me know if you want even... Chapter 40. The Fallout Victor. Langston was finally in handcuffs. Daniel watched as federal agents restrained his father, reading him his rights. Victor's signature smirk never wavered, but Daniel saw the truth in his eyes. Anger. Fear. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," Victor murmured as they hauled him toward the door. Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's what makes us different." Victor let out a soft chuckle. "No, son. That's what makes you weak." Then he was gone, swept away in a storm of flashing sirens and barking officers. Daniel let out a breath. It was over, or so he thought. Chapter 41. The Shadow. He left behind. Eleanor sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at the city lights. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "You're quiet," she exhaled. "It doesn't feel real." Daniel walked over, settling beside her. "Victor's done. He won't hurt us again." Eleanor turned to him, eyes shadowed. "You don't believe that?" Daniel hesitated, because she was right. Victor had built an empire on secrets, blackmail, and destruction. He didn't just lose. He always had an escape plan, and Daniel had the sinking feeling. This wasn't over. Not yet. Chapter 42. The Letter. The envelope arrived 2 days later. No return address, just Daniel's name, written in Victor's elegant scrawl. Margaret narrowed, her eyes as she held it up. "Do we even want to know what's inside?" Daniel took it from her, heart pounding. Eleanor tensed beside him. "Daniel!" He tore it open, a single piece of paper, a message, 2 words, "Checkmate, son." Daniel's blood ran cold, and then his phone rang. "Unknown number," he answered. A familiar voice rasped through the speaker. "I told you," Victor murmured. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." To be continued. Victor's in custody, but is he really defeated? Or is this just the beginning of a new war? Daniel and Eleanor thought they were free. But in Victor's world, no one ever truly escapes. Chapter 43. The Man in the Shadows. Daniel gripped the phone, his breath controlled but his pulse hammering. "You're in prison," he said flatly. Victor chuckled, the sound low and confident. "Oh, Daniel, do you really think walls can hold me?" Eleanor leaned in, her face pale. "Put it on speaker," she whispered. Daniel did. Victor's voice filled the room. "You think you won, but you don't even know what game you're playing. There are things you haven't uncovered yet. Things that will destroy everything you believe in." Daniel's grip tightened. "I don't care about your riddles, Victor." "Oh, but you will." A pause. Then, "You should ask Eleanor about Benjamin Vaughn." Eleanor froze. The name hit her like a bullet. Daniel turned to her, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Who is that?" Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came out. Victor's voice curled through the phone like poison. Ah, seems she's been keeping secrets too. Then, click, the line went dead. Chapter 44. Buried Lies. Silence stretched between them. Daniel stared at Eleanor. "Who is Benjamin Vaughn?" Eleanor's hands trembled as she set the phone down. Eleanor. His voice was sharp, demanding. "Tell me." She closed her eyes. "He was my fiancé." Daniel felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "What?" She swallowed hard. "Before I met you. Before all of this. I was engaged to Benjamin." Daniel ran a hand down his face, trying to process. "And you never thought to mention that?" Eleanor's voice was quiet. "Because he's dead." "Daniel." The words hung in the air like a noose. Daniel exhaled, his anger shifting into something colder. "And what does Victor have to do with this?" Eleanor shook her head. "I don't know." But Daniel wasn't convinced, because if Victor had brought it up, then nothing about Benjamin Vaughn's death was what it seemed. Chapter 45. Digging Up Ghosts. Margaret set the file down on the table. "That's everything we could pull on Benjamin Vaughn." She folded her arms. "He died in a car accident 5 years ago. Case closed." Daniel frowned. "And?" Margaret arched a brow. "And what?" "Nothing about Victor is that simple." Eleanor sat stiffly beside him, her hands locked together. "It was real, Daniel. He died." Margaret tapped her nails on the table. "Well, actually," Eleanor's head snapped up. "What?" Margaret hesitated. Then, "The coroner's report was sealed." Daniel's stomach dropped. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "What?" Margaret slid a document forward. "I pulled some strings. Turns out, Benjamin Vaughn's body was never officially identified." Daniel stared at the report. Eleanor looked like she couldn't breathe. No, that's impossible." Daniel's voice was dark. "Unless he's not dead." Eleanor paled, and suddenly Victor's words made horrifying sense. "You should ask Eleanor about Benjamin Vaughn, because Benjamin Vaughn might not just be alive. He might be working for Victor. To be continued. Is Benjamin Vaughn truly dead? Or has he been part of Victor's game all along? And if he is alive, what does he want?" Chapter 46. The Name That Won't Die. Eleanor gripped the edges of the table, her breath shallow. "This doesn't make sense." Daniel studied her, his mind racing. Had she known? Had she suspected? Margaret flipped another page in the file. The accident report was vague. Single-car crash, vehicle burned beyond recognition. But get this, the official autopsy was never released. Eleanor's nails dug into her palms. No, I buried him. I saw—" She stopped herself, closing her eyes. Daniel's voice was quiet. "Saw what?" She hesitated. "The casket." Silence fell over the room. Margaret exhaled. "No one saw the body, did they?" Eleanor shook her head, horror dawning in her eyes. Daniel leaned forward, voice razor-sharp. "If Benjamin Vaughn didn't die 5 years ago, then where the hell has he been?" Margaret tapped the report. "That's the million-dollar question," but Daniel already knew the answer. Victor. And that meant, whatever was coming next, it wouldn't be good. Chapter 47. Ghosts Resurfacing. 2 days later, Daniel got the message, a plain white envelope. No postage, no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid. The image sent ice through his veins. It was Eleanor, captured from a distance, standing at their apartment window, and below it, scrawled in ink, "Miss me, Ellie?" Daniel clenched his jaw. Eleanor stood beside him, staring at the photo like it might set itself on fire. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Benjamin?" Daniel turned to Margaret. "Find him," Margaret nodded. "Already on it." Eleanor swallowed hard. "Daniel, if he's alive, he's been watching you." His voice was steel. "That's not love, Eleanor. That's a threat." Eleanor shuddered. "But why?" Daniel already had an idea, because if Benjamin had been working for Victor all these years, this wasn't just about Eleanor. It was about revenge. Chapter 48. The trap is set that night. Daniel sat in the dim light of his office, staring at the Polaroid. Margaret's voice came through his earpiece. "We traced the photo's origin, a camera store downtown. Cash payment, no security footage of the buyer." Daniel exhaled. "Of course." Eleanor paced behind him. "What do we do?" Daniel set the photo down. "We make him come to us." Eleanor hesitated. "How?" Daniel turned, his expression cold and calculated. "By giving him exactly what he wants." Eleanor met his gaze. "You mean me?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "I won't let him touch you." Eleanor swallowed hard. "I know. Because if Benjamin Vaughn had returned, then it was time to end this. Once and for all. To be continued. Who is Benjamin Vaughn now? And what game is he playing? Daniel and Eleanor thought they knew their past. But some ghosts don't stay buried. And this one, he's coming home. Let me know if you... Chapter 49. The bait Daniel stood on the penthouse balcony, gripping his whiskey glass so tightly he thought it might shatter. Below, the city pulsed with life, clueless to the storm brewing in the shadows. Behind him, Eleanor leaned against the four, railing, her expression unreadable. "You really think he'll come?" she asked softly. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned, studying her face. The hesitation, the fear she was trying to hide. "He's already watching," Daniel murmured. "Now we make him move." Eleanor swallowed hard. "And when he does?" Daniel's expression hardened. "We end this." Chapter 50. The first move. The message arrived at midnight. A text, unknown number. "You always did look beautiful under city lights." Eleanor's breath hitched as she stared at the screen. Daniel read over her shoulder, his jaw clenching. "He's playing games." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the phone. "Then let's play back." Daniel exhaled. "Are you sure?" She turned to face him, her eyes dark with something new. "I'm done being afraid." A slow smirk curled. Daniel's lips. "Then let's give him what he wants." Chapter 51. Into the Fire. The plan was simple. Eleanor would go to their usual cafe, the one she and Benjamin used to frequent before his supposed death. She'd sit by the window, alone, vulnerable. And Daniel? He'd be watching. Margaret set up the surveillance, tracking every shadow, every possible escape route. "Are we really underestimating him like this?" she muttered as she adjusted the earpiece in Eleanor's ear. Daniel glanced at Eleanor. "She's not bait. She's the trigger." Eleanor lifted her chin. "If he's out there, he'll come to me." Margaret sighed. "Then let's just hope we see him before he sees us." Chapter. A ghost returns. The cafe was warm, filled with the scent of espresso and freshly baked croissants. Eleanor sat by the window, stirring her tea, her pulse hammering. She could feel it. Someone watching. Then, a reflection flickered in the window. A man. Tall, dark hair, familiar. Her breath caught. It couldn't be. Slowly, deliberately, she turned, and there he was. Benjamin Vaughn, alive, smiling, like he had never left. To be continued. Benjamin Vaughn is back. But is he the same man Eleanor loved, or something far worse? Daniel has set the trap. But in this game of ghosts and betrayals, who Is really hunting who? Chapter 53. The Devil. You know, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Benjamin Vaughn stood before her, very much alive. His blue eyes, ones she had dreamed about for years, held a quiet amusement. But beneath it, something colder lurked. "You're staring," he said, sliding into the seat across from her as if 5 years hadn't passed. Eleanor gripped her teacup, forcing herself to breathe. "I thought you were dead." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Benjamin smiled. "And yet, here I am." Her hands trembled, but she forced them steady. "How?" Benjamin leaned forward, his presence suffocating. "Does it matter?" She wanted to scream that it did. That his disappearance had shattered her, that she had mourned him, that she had tried to rebuild her life, that she had loved again. Instead, she swallowed hard. "Where have you been?" Benjamin tilted his head. "I could ask the same, Ellie. I come back, and what do I find? You married. To him." Eleanor stiffened. "Daniel." Benjamin's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Tell me, Ellie, does he know the truth?" Her heart slammed against her ribs. "The truth about what?" Benjamin exhaled dramatically. "Come now, don't insult me. We both know this marriage is built on lies." Her fingers curled into fists. "You don't know anything about us." Benjamin chuckled, low and knowing. "Oh, Eleanor." He leaned in, voice barely a murmur. "I know everything." Chapter 54. Listening. In across the street, Daniel sat in his car, watching. The small earpiece buzzed softly, picking up every word. Margaret's voice came through his other ear. "We have a problem." Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Tell me something I don't know." Margaret exhaled. Facial recognition confirmed it. "It's him." Daniel's stomach twisted. "And?" Margaret hesitated. "And he shouldn't exist." Daniel's pulse spiked. "Explain." Margaret clicked a few keys. "The man sitting across from Eleanor? His file was sealed, not just police reports, his entire record, as if someone erased him from existence." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Victor?" Margaret exhaled. "That's my guess. If Vaughn is alive, he's not just some lost lover. He's a goddamn asset." Daniel's eyes darkened. "Then I'll treat him like one." Margaret hesitated. "Daniel, be careful. We don't know what he wants." Daniel's voice was ice. "I don't care what he wants." He stared through the windshield at Eleanor and Benjamin. "He's not taking her from me." Chapter 55. Unfinished business. Eleanor's hands were ice cold. Benjamin studied her carefully. "You're scared," she swallowed. "Should I be?" Benjamin smirked. "That depends." Her skin crawled. "On what?" Benjamin's voice was smooth, practiced. "On whether you still love me." She inhaled sharply. "Benjamin, I—" "Remember the way you looked at me?" he murmured. "I remember every promise you made." Eleanor clenched her fists. "And I remember standing over your grave." Benjamin's smirk faded. For the first time, something flickered in his expression. Regret? Anger? Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "I had no choice," he said softly. Eleanor's eyes burned. "No choice but to let me think you died?" Benjamin exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't want to leave you, Ellie, but I was given an option. Disappear or die for real." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "Who forced you?" Benjamin's jaw tightened. "Victor." Her heart stopped. "Victor killed you?" Benjamin leaned in, voice low. "Victor made me into something else." Eleanor's hands trembled. "What?" Benjamin's lips parted. Then suddenly his eyes flickered past her towards the window. Eleanor turned. Outside, standing across the street, was Daniel. watching, waiting. Benjamin smirked. Well, well, he leaned back. Looks like your husband's jealous. Eleanor's chest tightened, because she knew Daniel, and she knew that look in his eyes. This wasn't jealousy, it was war. To be continued. Benjamin Vaughn is back, but is he an ally or a deadly enemy? Victor's influence runs deeper than Eleanor and Daniel ever imagined. And with tensions rising, one thing is certain. Someone won't make it out of this alive. Let me know if you want even more deception, danger, and jaw-dropping twists.